And what does that precedent mean for succeeding presidents, including, arguably, the incumbent? The fact of the matter is that presidents in wartime should be measured not only for what their generals do on the field of battle, but for what they do in terms of their attitude toward the Constitution, which ultimately, along with American territory, is what is being defended. And this has always been a source of controversy, going way back to John Adams, who I think should be lionized for very courageously keeping us out of a shooting war with France. But at the same time, he allowed Congress to pass what's called the Alien and Sedition Acts, which first of all gave the president the personal authority to eliminate, to send back to their homelands aliens, quote unquote, who were thought to pose a threat to the war effort, and perhaps even more insidiously, made it a crime for anyone to publicly criticize the president or the government or their policies. Now, it's easy to say, oh, well, that was 200 years ago. Guess what? It happened again in World War I under Woodrow Wilson. And Wilson is profoundly a man of peace. Wilson, as a boy growing up in the South right after the war, his earliest memory was of seeing Jefferson Davis shackled, being led away through the streets right after the fall of Richmond. The fact is that Woodrow Wilson risked his presidency when the Lusitania was sunk in 1915 by saying there's such a thing as a man being too proud to fight. In 1916, he was reelected on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Well, he didn't keep us out of war much longer, because just a few months later, with equal passion and moral fervor, he went before Congress and asked for and obtained a declaration of war. But here's what's revealing about Wilson. Wilson himself had said, before he asked for that declaration of war, "Once lead this nation into war, and they'll forget there ever was such a thing as tolerance. The spirit of ruthless brutality will enter into every fiber of our national life." Well, he knew whatever he spoke, because his own administration secured passage of a modern Sedition Act in 1918, which gave the president the power, as in Adams's day. This is the quote: "It's illegal to, quote, utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language," unquote, about the government, the Constitution, the American flag, or, quote, the uniform of the Army or Navy of the United States. Now that is a pretty broad mandate. And not surprisingly, it was exercised. Before the end of 1917, Woodrow Wilson would jail socialist candidate Eugene Debs and deport the anarchist Emma Goldman for verbally impeding the country's first draft. Hundreds of others were prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or hounded by jingos who smashed Beethoven records and banned German courses from American campuses. The city of Cincinnati, with a large German-American population, went a step further by banning the consumption of German pretzels at the lunch hour. The governor of Iowa declared it illegal to converse over the telephone in any language but English. Well, Wilson has paid a high price. But again, it's not simple. On the one hand, he was a brilliant war leader. He was a great orator. You know, he had a vocabulary of 63,000 words. Sometimes he was intoxicated by his own oratory. But he brought the American people to fever pitch. He and he alone persuaded this nation against all its instincts that for the first time in our history, we should leave our shores and we should send an expeditionary force. Hundreds of thousands, eventually millions of men were actually put into uniform, drafted, and sent overseas. Why? To protect protect democracy, to extend democracy, a war to end war, a war to punish German militarism. There was a host of vague, frankly, admirable explanations justifying World War I. The problem was Wilson succeeded too much. The fact is, he had raised the nation's sights, he had raised the nation's expectations. And when the war ended and reality intruded and European power politics came back into play, and Wilson found himself at the Versailles Conference where glittering words really didn't matter very much against the likes of Lloyd George and Clemenceau and all of the old world diplomats there, well, let's just say he was riding for a fall. He wanted to remake the world, which is a very American thing to do. Wilson once said, sometimes people accuse me of being an idealist. That's all right, that's how I know I'm an American, because America is the only idealistic nation in the world. Well, that didn't sit well with his allies, who had bled and fought longer, harder, at greater price for survival, let alone remaking mankind. The Premier of France, this wonderful cynic, world-weary Parisian Georges Clemenceau, didn't much care for Wilson. He said it was like, you know, debating Jesus Christ every day. And he also said that the 14 points were wildly impractical. After all, God himself was content with 10 commandments. The irony, of course, and the tragedy is that Wilson destroyed his health and destroyed his historical reputation in many quarters. And finally, in the ultimate supreme irony, he destroyed his own country's chances of going into the League of Nations, which is why he went to Versailles, why he justified fighting the war. The idea of setting up a world peacekeeping body where rationality would replace emotionalism and nationalism and ethnic hatred. We still, as Americans, are drawn to the Wilsonian vision because we're Americans. We still find that hugely appealing. And I think it's one of the ways that you can look at American history. It's like a seesaw. We go back and forth between realpolitik of the sort that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon practiced, and the Wilsonian vision, the kind of messianic notion of a city on a hill, the old American notion that this is a country placed here by God with a purpose, that we are exceptional. In any event, I once heard Lady Bird Johnson describe her efforts to get her husband to pose for his White House portrait before the strain of the Vietnam War broke him physically, as an earlier war had broken Woodrow Wilson. Lyndon Johnson, of course, the great irony is, wanted to fight desperately another war. He wanted to fight a war on poverty. You know, as a young man teaching Mexican school children in Cotulla, Texas, that's the war he wanted to fight, the Great Society. The idea, whether you approve it or disapprove it, fired by, again, very American energy and idealism and ambition and a belief that all things are possible if you have enough goodwill and enough resources. And I mean all things are possible. You can have guns, you can have butter, you can have the Great Society, and you can make Vietnam free. And that's what Lyndon Johnson pursued in the White House. We now know that he had doubts about whether the war in Southeast Asia was in fact winnable. Lyndon Johnson, I think, illustrates one other point that I think applies to all presidents. We all like to think of our presidents as men of culture, men of learning, men of the perceptiveness and the insight that comes with a knowledge of history. But what happens when presidents become a prisoner of history, when they become a prisoner of the past? And what do I mean by that? Lyndon Johnson was of the generation whose worldview was defined at great cost by Munich. That is to say, you do not reward a bully, Adolf Hitler, for aggression. That was the lesson of the 1930s, paid for an enormous sacrifice in the 1940s. And in the abstract, no one would dispute that. But guess what? Vietnam wasn't Munich. That's not the only historical lesson that was branded on Lyndon Johnson. Remember, LBJ liked politics. He once said, I don't really think about politics more than 18 hours a day.